When Maria Boshkareva walked into a Russian military recruitment office in January 1915, she was turned away. Regulations prohibited women. She appealed directly to Tsar Nicholas II by telegram, a communication method that should have been ignored, and received personal authorization to enlist. She fought on the Eastern Front for 2 years, earning the St. George's Cross and 3 additional military honors before the 1917 revolution gave her one last assignment, commanding the 1st Russian Women's Battalion of Death, a unit of 2,000 women formed specifically to shame male soldiers into continuing to fight. The battalion held the German line at the Battle of Smorgon in July 1917, while thousands of male soldiers abandoned their positions. Of the 2,000 women who entered combat that day, roughly 300 survived without serious injury. Bochkareva herself was wounded a 3rd time. The military commendation she received afterward noted exceptional valor. The historical footnote she received afterward noted almost nothing at all. By the time Soviet historians were done with the 20th century, her name had largely disappeared from the official record because she was the wrong kind of hero for the wrong kind of government. But there's a problem with the erasure narrative, and it cuts in an unexpected direction. Some women weren't erased by accident. Some were erased on purpose by the institutions that needed their story to stay buried. Nzinga Mbande became queen of the Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms in present-day Angola in 1624. She was approximately 40 years old. Over the next 4 decades, she ran a military campaign against Portuguese colonial forces that lasted until she was in her 80s, negotiating alliances, leading battlefield operations personally, and at one point converting to Christianity strategically, using the baptismal ceremony to publicly shame the Portuguese governor who had refused to give her a chair at a diplomatic meeting. She made him the chair. She sat on one of her attendants instead, forcing him to look down at a woman who outranked him in every way that mattered. Portuguese colonial records from the 1640s describe her in terms that shift between savagery and barely concealed bewilderment. She was still fighting them at 82. She died in 1663 in her bed as queen. Portuguese accounts of Angola written in the following century mention her briefly in footnotes as a historical curiosity. European history textbooks written in the 20th century largely left her out entirely, not because she was obscure, but because a woman who beat a colonial power for 40 years doesn't fit cleanly into the story colonialism told about itself. Here's what all 5 of these women have in common, and it isn't what the inspirational version of this story usually claims. It isn't that they were exceptional in the way we use that word now, meaning rare. They were exceptional in the way a 5th century Scythian archer was exceptional, through years of specific physical training that the culture around them actually provided. The Scythian steppe did not prevent girls from learning to ride and shoot. The Ndongo kingdom did not prevent Nzinga from learning military strategy. The societies that produced these women weren't accidentally progressive. They had survival pressures that made female combat competence a practical asset, not an ideological statement. The erasure came afterward, and it was almost never random. In 1429, a 17-year-old from the village of Demormy led a French army to relieve the siege of Orleans, a city that had been under English blockade for 7 months and that French military commanders had classified as strategically unretrievable. Joan of Arc's army broke the siege in 9 days. She was captured the following year, tried for heresy and cross-dressing, and burned at the stake at 19. The trial records survive. They run to several hundred pages. The judges spent considerable effort on the question of her clothing. 25 years after her execution, a formal retrial declared her innocent on every count. The church that burned her eventually canonized her. That gap, 25 years, 2 trials, 1 fire, is not a bureaucratic delay. It is the precise amount of time required for the people who needed her dead to no longer be in a position to prevent her rehabilitation. History didn't forget Joan of Arc. History had to be legally forced to remember her correctly. There is one more name that belongs in this record, not a warrior in the battlefield sense, a warrior in the documented, inconvenient, impossible to erase sense. Lozan was a Cheyenne Apache military strategist and medicine woman who fought alongside Victorio in the Apache Wars from the late 1870s through 1880. She was described by Victorio himself in accounts recorded by anthropologist Eve Ball in interviews with Apache survivors compiled in the 1970s and published in the book Inde as a shield to her people. She scouted terrain, led groups of women and children across the Rio Grande under fire, and was present at most of the significant engagements of the final Apache resistance. She was captured in 1886 alongside Geronimo and died of tuberculosis at the Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama in 1889. The U.S. Army's official records of the Apache campaign mention her in passing, in a single sentence. She does not appear in the popular histories of the era. She does not appear in the films. She barely appears in the textbooks. The Apache oral tradition, however, preserved her exactly. The erasure failed in the direction it was aimed, at the people who knew her best, and succeeded only with everyone else. Go back to that courtyard in 1917. The officer pinning the medal onto Maria Bochkareva's chest. The uncomfortable eye contact. What he was looking at wasn't an anomaly. It was the edge of a very long list. Scythian archers buried with their arrowheads. A Viking commander in a grave at Birka. Nzinga sitting on a living chair to make a colonial governor feel small. A 17-year-old breaking a 7-month siege in 9 days. A woman crossing the Rio Grande under fire while the army wrote one sentence about it. History didn't forget these women. It remembered them precisely enough to know they were dangerous. The real weapon was never the sword, it was the record of who held it.